So I'm here with Yuri. We're talking about history, and in this particular case, we're gonna go and dive into the question of why did the Soviets get involved in the Afghanistan War in 1979? Go ahead, please explain to us a little bit, start off, and go ahead.
Okay, cool. Well, it's a much longer topic than the time will allow, but briefly, in 1973, Afghanistan, which was a kingdom ruled by a king named Zahir Shah, underwent what is known as the Saur Revolution, and that was a socialist takeover of the country. And what happened was that during that time, they share a border with the USSR, and it was a very chaotic moment in a society that is very agrarian and also very religious and religion-based. Also a society that has a plethora of different ethnic groups and different cultures, and it's a very tribal area. However, it's still under one polity. So the socialists take over. What happened with that was that a lot of, not immediately, but over time, it started clashing with a lot more traditional values, and people started taking a much more secular approach to education, less Islamic based. So not to get into too many detail of that, for the 5 years of the Saur Revolution, the Americans and the Pakistanis became very interested in the goings-on, as did the Soviets, because the ideological leanings of the new Afghani government was more ideologically aligned with the USSR and socialism and collectivism, as opposed to, let's call it, I'm not going to call it blatant imperialism, but more, let's just say capitalism for lack of a better word. Now, inside the party, there were numerous crises, and it led with the head of the Saur movement being deposed by a gentleman named Hafizullah Amin. Now, Hafizullah Amin was essentially trying to work out backdoor deals with the USSR to get more support, because throughout the Afghan country, many radical Islamic groups, not so much radical actually, some radical but some more traditional based, started having serious problems with the direction of socialist cultural movements within the nation. Now, back then, Americans and the Soviets would take serious interest in anything that happens on each other's border. So a major incident that happened was the kidnapping of the American ambassador. I forget his name at the moment. He was kidnapped by a radical communist group because there was a lot of tumult in those ranks, and he was murdered, assassinated, while in captivity. Now, the Americans suspected that there was KGB involvement in that. They actually suspected that a Soviet military KGB advisor was at the scene, but as it turns out, we still don't really know what happened. So essentially...
Can I make an assumption that the United States made their own assumption that the Russians were involved and they wanted to teach them a lesson? And therefore Russia was saying, no, I will not allow you, and they intervened back.
It's a natural assumption to make, but it kind of negates the bigger picture of what was happening, because the Americans had just finished fighting a war 4 years earlier in Vietnam, and that was a very long, costly war, guerrilla warfare that cost millions of Vietnamese lives and tens of thousands of American lives.
So they don't want to take chances. They blame the first person or something.
No, chances are what they actually wanted to take. They wanted to take chances dramatically, because the American National Security Advisor was named Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Polish gentleman who had a very strong distaste for communism because his family back in Poland was chased away during the communist times.
He used to live in America.
He was living in America back then. He's actually a very prominent family. His daughter at the moment is actually host of MSNBC's Morning Joe. Her name is Mika Brzezinski.
If we try to shorten it and summarize that, can I say that is that correct? If I say that Russia tried to defend their name, and that's why they entered the war?
Yes and no. Because the thing about the Soviet Union is that there was a lot of factions within the Communist Party itself, within the Politburo. And so you had the KGB faction, you had the army faction, you had the more traditional communist faction, and even the communist faction was split. So the inclination of the Soviet Union was to not necessarily invade. It was more, how can we help these people? The people. I don't want to make it seem like there were Santa Claus out there trying to help every little boy and girl in Afghanistan.
No.
They were trying to boost their allies in the government. Right.
And they try to defend their name at the same time, help the allies. So it's like two birds with one stone.
Well, what happened
so it was almost a no choice. They had to get into that war.
More or less, because
and defend.
Some people, Brezhnev, who was the General Secretary of the USSR back in those days, he was very hesitant to join. Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the KGB and later became Soviet Secretary General in 1982, was a much more hardline gentleman. He was the one, as we discussed earlier, he was the one who directed the invasion of Hungary in 1953 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. He was a very hardline man who believed in crushing dissent with brute force. Now, eventually they ended up winning, and it's funny because my parents back in those days used to tell me that there were rumors of military incursions from Afghanistan by radical Islamic groups into the Soviet republics in Central Asia, like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and as it turns out, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said himself, the American involvement in that war began before the Soviet invasion. It became in early 1979, with funding and encouraging jihadist groups to do cross-border raids into the USSR. So the Soviet army was on high alert, and with those provocations, that what they saw as provocations happening, they decided it would be much better to invade and stabilize. Now, they invaded very quickly. They invaded all the major highways, and they sent in a team of Spetsnaz into Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, and they basically took the presidential palace and they assassinated the president in his office.
So in that case, if I can use a metaphor, it's like there are kids fighting, and Russia or Soviets decided that we need to intervene, get in that room, and put those kids straight. Basically, I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, but
it's
the idea was that they saw something unfair happening.
Not necessarily
people
unfair.
Fighting,
not necessarily unfair. They saw a fight. It's more like, if you use your metaphor, they saw a fight happening in their backyard, and they couldn't have that.
Right.
So they went in there very strongly, and they basically picked a winner. And they beat the loser.
And they made sure
and they beat the loser.
Did they pick the winner before joining?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, they knew who
they had the next selected person in mind who they wanted to put in the presidential palace. Got it. And with that, it began. So the invasion happened rather quickly. But as the Americans found out in Iraq in 2003, because Vietnam was a different situation, they never actually invaded Vietnam. They were there as military advisor. But as they found out in 2003, the invasion happens quickly. Then you have to quote unquote win the peace, but that's not the peace. There was a new phase of the war where a lot of the groups that were causing trouble for the communist Afghani government started causing troubles for them. And
so they made sure that it's not America that picks the winner in Afghanistan, but they pick the winner. That's why in their minds it was basically we cannot risk having an Afghani government that would turn over to the Americans. And with that, I guess we could say they acted decisively but hesitantly. So just to make a quick summary before we end this particular episode, Afghanistan is Russia's backyard in a sense, or front yard or backyard in a way that as many other countries are, right? Not the Russians, sorry, my bad, Soviets. And when they saw that the United States were trying to control that part of the backyard,
they didn't see that, but they didn't want to take the chance.
They didn't want to take a chance. As soon as they saw any potential signs, they decided that, look, I'm going to go back there in that corner of my backyard and I'm going to set things straight and I'm going to assign whoever's going to control it, because it's been working fine, and now what is happening? There's fighting.
Yes,
so they came into control.
It's a situation that's somewhat like a little bit like the Cuban situation in the 1960s. They couldn't risk the fact that instability in the country would flip someone they share a border with into the camp of the United States, because Pakistan, whose borders Afghanistan, was already on the American side. So if they don't have Afghanistan, which was a more or less neutral buffer zone, there would be trouble. So they acted again decisively but hesitantly. But in typical Soviet style, they went in very strongly and with the necessary force in many cases, and they didn't exactly know what they were getting into, because if you want to talk about Afghanistan, no one from the days of Alexander the Great was able to conquer and hold Afghanistan. Because it's not a place that can be conquered. The Afghani mountains are called Hindu Kush, which in Pashtun, which is the main ethnic group in Afghanistan means the mountains where Hindus go to die. When the Hindus were trying to invade them from way back.
As a matter of fact, I think this explains it, and we can wrap it up here. But I think this is a great beginning for the next episode, and where we can talk a little bit more about
talk about a number of
that
things.
concept.
We can talk about,
and eventually in the future episodes, we can speak about Cuba. We can speak about all those historical events that happened because of Soviets and Russia and the United States being in a certain kind of conflict and a competition.
You could say that. You could say it was Soviet America. It always is that. Afghanistan is a very special place geopolitically speaking. It has been historically speaking, and it's Afghanistan, Cuba, all those things, they touch us to this day. I mean, after 9/11, I think everybody pretty much knows that Afghanistan is something, and we can. There's a lot to talk about.
Awesome, that was very good. Thank you very much, Yuri.
You are very welcome.
In the next episode, we'll touch more deeply on that subject, and we'll move on to the next one, and we'll go forward with that. We'll explore Soviets' conflict with the United States pre the collapse. Actually, we can always use examples of post-collapse to explain.
No, it's all early. It's all pre-collapse, post-collapse. It all ties together.
History is a cycle.
It's a cycle. It
repeats itself.
It's a thread. It doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Let's put it that way.
That's a very good way to end this. Thank you very much, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Click, share, subscribe, all that good stuff.